For over 2,000 years, one of history's most audacious lies has been perpetuated in classrooms, museums, and scholarly texts across the world. The civilization that gave humanity its first alphabet, established the Mediterranean's most extensive trade networks, and founded the legendary city of Carthage, has been systematically stripped of its true identity. The Phoenicians, masters of the ancient seas, who connected 3 continents through commerce and culture, have been whitewashed from their African origins and repackaged as ambiguous Semitic peoples whose racial identity conveniently remains a mystery. From the skeletal remains of the Natufian peoples, who first inhabited Canaan, to the genetic studies revealing their lack of Neanderthal DNA, from the biblical genealogies placing them among the sons of Ham, to their own historian Sanchuniathon's accounts of their African origins. Every piece of evidence points to the same revolutionary truth. We will explore how Ta'autus, the Phoenician equivalent of the Egyptian god Thoth, gifted humanity with alphabetic writing, an African intellectual achievement that democratized literacy and laid the foundation for all modern communication. We will examine the archaeological evidence from Tyre to Carthage, the linguistic connections to ancient Egyptian, and the artistic representations that consistently depict distinctly African features. The Phoenicians called their homeland Canaan, derived from Kin-Anu, meaning belonging to the Anu, the black people who founded Egyptian civilization. The Greeks called them Phoenicians, meaning dark-skinned people. The Egyptians knew them as Djahi. The archaeological record provides unambiguous evidence that the first inhabitants of the region that would become Phoenicia were a black African people known to modern archaeology as the Natufians. This culture, which flourished in the Levant from approximately 15,000 to 11,500 years ago, laid the foundation for all subsequent civilizations in the region, including the Phoenicians. The Natufian culture represents a crucial transitional period in human history, marking the shift from nomadic hunter-gatherer societies to settled agricultural communities. These were not primitive peoples, as Eurocentric archaeology has often portrayed them, but sophisticated societies with complex social structures, advanced tool-making technologies, and the beginnings of architectural development. Most importantly for our analysis, they were unequivocally African in their physical characteristics and cultural practices. The Senegalese scholar Cheikh Anta Diop, whose work Nations Nègres et Culture, 1954, revolutionized our understanding of African history, was among the first to recognize the true identity of the Natufians. In his meticulous analysis of the archaeological evidence, Diop stated unequivocally, "L'homme trouvé en Canaan, à la préhistoire, le Natuféen, est un négroïde." Diop's conclusion was based on extensive craniometric analysis of Natufian skeletal remains, which consistently showed the dolichocephalic, long-headed skull shape characteristic of African populations. This finding was not an isolated observation, but part of a broader pattern of evidence that Diop meticulously documented throughout his career. His work demonstrated that the entire early population of the so-called Near East was fundamentally African in character. The Natufians were not simply the predecessors of the Phoenicians. They were their direct ancestors, the black African people who would eventually develop into the great maritime civilization that dominated the Mediterranean. Modern archaeological research has continued to confirm Diop's pioneering insights. The 2016 study by Iosif Lazaridis and colleagues, published in Nature, provided genetic evidence that supports the African connections of the Natufian population. The study found that Natufian populations possessed what researchers termed basal Eurasian ancestry, a genetic component that had separated from other non-African lineages before they diverged from each other and crucially had no Neanderthal admixture. This genetic profile is consistent with an African origin for the Natufian population. The absence of significant Neanderthal DNA, which is found in all European and most Asian populations, strongly suggests that the Natufians maintained their African genetic heritage even after migrating to the Levant. As the study noted, craniometric analyses have suggested that the Natufians possibly migrated from Africa. The implications of this finding are profound. It means that the foundational population of the Levant, from which the Phoenicians would emerge, was not only African in origin, but maintained its African genetic character for thousands of years. The transition from Natufian culture to what we recognize as Phoenician civilization was not a replacement of one people by another, but rather the natural evolution of the same African population as they adapted to changing environmental and social conditions. The end of the last ice age brought new challenges and opportunities to the Levant, and the descendants of the Natufians responded by developing new technologies, social structures, and cultural practices. The development of agriculture, which began during the late Natufian period, provided the economic foundation for the more complex societies that would follow. The domestication of wheat, barley, and other crops allowed for larger, more stable populations, which in turn supported the development of specialized crafts, long-distance trade, and the complex urban societies that would characterize Phoenician civilization. The continuity between Natufian and Phoenician cultures is evident in many aspects of material culture. The same basic architectural techniques, the same artistic motifs, and the same burial practices can be traced from the Natufian period through to the Neolithic period, the height of Phoenician civilization. This continuity reflects the fundamental fact that we are dealing with the same people, Black Africans who adapted and evolved their culture over thousands of years while maintaining their essential identity. The ancient texts discovered at Ras Shamra, ancient Ugarit, provide direct testimony from the Phoenicians themselves about their origins. These cuneiform tablets, dating from the 14th to 12th centuries BCE, contain extensive mythological and historical material that reveals how the Phoenicians understood their own identity and origins. In these texts, the Phoenicians consistently trace their origins back to Egypt, identifying themselves as descendants of the great African civilization of the Nile Valley. This is not surprising when we consider that Canaan itself derives from Kin Anu, meaning belonging to the Anu. The Anu were the black people from the Great Lakes region of Africa, who were instrumental in founding Egyptian civilization, according to African historical traditions preserved by scholars like Sheikh Anta Diop. The Ras Shamra texts describe elaborate genealogies that connect the Phoenician royal houses to Egyptian dynasties, and they preserve mythological accounts that clearly derive from African cosmological traditions. The creation myths found in these texts, for example, begin with primordial waters and darkness, themes that are central to African creation stories throughout the continent. These texts also preserve accounts of the great migrations that brought the ancestors of the Phoenicians from Egypt to the Levantine coast. According to these accounts, the migration was not a single event, but a series of movements over many generations, as Egyptian populations gradually established themselves along the eastern Mediterranean coast. Even the Greeks and Romans, despite their later attempts to claim the Phoenicians as part of their own cultural sphere, preserved testimonies that confirm the African identity of the Phoenicians. The very name Phoenician is Greek in origin, and according to the British biologist and historian Gavin de Beer, it means dark skin or dark-skinned people. This Greek designation was not accidental or metaphorical. The Greeks were describing what they actually observed when they encountered the Phoenicians, a people with distinctly dark skin that marked them as different from the lighter-skinned populations of the northern Mediterranean. The fact that the Greeks chose to identify the Phoenicians primarily by their skin color indicates that this was their most distinctive characteristic from a Greek perspective. Roman sources provide similar testimony. The historian Tacitus, writing in the 1st century CE, describes the Phoenicians as having dark complexions and notes their cultural connections to Africa. Other Roman writers consistently describe Phoenician religious practices, artistic styles, and social customs as being fundamentally African in character. The Roman poet Silius Italicus, in his epic poem Punica about the wars between Rome and Carthage, repeatedly describes the Carthaginians, Phoenician colonists, as dark-skinned and connects them explicitly to their African origins. These descriptions were not poetic license, but reflected the actual appearance of the people the Romans were fighting. The Egyptians, who had extensive contact with the Phoenicians throughout their history, knew them as the Dyahi people. Egyptian records consistently describe the Dyahi as kinsmen and allies, not as foreign peoples. The Egyptian artistic representations of the Jahi show them with the same physical characteristics as the Egyptians themselves: dark skin, African facial features, and similar clothing and hairstyles. The Egyptian name, Jahi, is itself significant. In Egyptian hieroglyphics, the name is written with symbols that emphasize the connection between these people and the Egyptian homeland. The Egyptians clearly understood the Phoenicians to be part of their own cultural and racial family, not as foreigners or enemies. Egyptian diplomatic records show that marriages between Egyptian and Phoenician royal families were common, and that Phoenician princes and princesses were welcomed at the Egyptian court as equals. This level of social integration would have been impossible if the Phoenicians had been racially different from the Egyptians. The ease with which Phoenicians moved between their homeland and Egypt, and the frequency of intermarriage between the two peoples, demonstrates their fundamental kinship. The Greek historian Herodotus, often called the father of history, provides crucial testimony about Phoenician origins in his Histories. Writing in the 5th century BCE, Herodotus states that the Phoenicians originally came from the Erythraean Sea, the Red Sea region, which connects the Arabian Peninsula to the Horn of Africa. Herodotus's account is particularly valuable because he was writing relatively close in time to the events he describes, and he had access to Phoenician sources that are now lost. His description of Phoenician origins in the Red Sea region is consistent with the broader pattern of African migration into the Levant that we see in other sources. More importantly, Herodotus describes the Phoenicians as having dark skin and notes their cultural practices as being similar to those of the Egyptians and other African peoples. He describes their religious ceremonies, their burial practices, and their social customs as being fundamentally African in character. Herodotus also preserves accounts of Phoenician expeditions that circumnavigated Africa, demonstrating their intimate knowledge of the African continent and their ongoing connections to their ancestral homeland. These expeditions would have been impossible without extensive knowledge of African geography, languages, and cultures, knowledge that could only have come from their African origins. The most widely known ancient text that addresses Phoenician origins is the Bible, specifically the genealogical account in Genesis 10:6, which states, "And the sons of Ham are Cush, Mizraim, Punt, and Canaan." This passage is not merely a religious text, but represents one of the oldest surviving ethnographic documents of the ancient Near East, preserving crucial information about how ancient peoples understood their own origins and relationships. The significance of this biblical passage cannot be overstated. Ham, whose name derives from the ancient Egyptian word kam, meaning charcoal or black, is explicitly identified as the ancestor of the black nations of Africa and the Near East. The text places Canaan, the Phoenicians, directly within this African genealogical framework, alongside Cush, Sudan, Nubia, Mizraim, Egypt, and Punt, the Horn of Africa and Great Lakes region. This biblical testimony is particularly powerful because it represents the understanding of ancient peoples themselves, not the interpretations of modern scholars. The authors of Genesis were writing from within the ancient Near Eastern cultural context and had direct knowledge of the peoples they were describing. Their placement of Canaan among the sons of Ham reflects the contemporary understanding that the Canaanites Phoenicians were part of the broader African world. The word Kam itself provides crucial linguistic evidence. In ancient Egyptian, Kam meant not only black. The Egyptians called themselves Kamites or Kemtiu, the black people, and this term has cognates throughout African languages. In various African languages today, we find similar words: Kami in some East African languages, Kum in others, Kembu in Central African languages, and Kala in West African languages, all meaning black, burned, or charcoal. This linguistic evidence demonstrates that the biblical identification of Ham with blackness was not metaphorical, but literal, reflecting the actual physical appearance and self-identification of these ancient peoples. When the Bible places Canaan among the sons of Ham, it is making a clear statement about the racial identity of the Phoenicians. The Phoenician language itself provides evidence of African origins. While Phoenician is classified as a Semitic language, It contains numerous elements that connect it to African language families. The vocabulary, grammatical structures, and phonetic patterns of Phoenician show clear influences from African languages, particularly those of the Nile Valley and the Horn of Africa. The Phoenician alphabet, which forms the foundation of all modern alphabetic writing systems, shows clear connections to Egyptian hieroglyphic writing. Many of the letter forms can be traced directly to Egyptian hieroglyphs, and the principle of alphabetic writing itself was developed from Egyptian hieroglyphic and hieratic scripts. Among all the ancient sources that speak to Phoenician origins, none is more important than Sanchuniathon, the Phoenician historian and priest who lived before the Trojan War, approximately 13th century BCE. Sanchuniathon represents the authentic voice of Phoenician civilization, not the interpretations of foreign observers, but the testimony of a Phoenician intellectual who had access to the most sacred and ancient traditions of his people. Sanchuniathon's work, originally written in the Phoenician language, has come down to us through the Greek translation of Philo of Byblos, 1st to 2nd century CE, and the preservation efforts of the Christian historian Eusebius of Caesarea, 3rd to 4th century CE. While some modern scholars have questioned the authenticity of Sanchuniathon's work, the discovery of the Ugaritic texts at Ras Shamra has confirmed many details of his accounts, demonstrating that he had access to genuine ancient Phoenician traditions. The importance of Sanchuniathon cannot be overstated. He provides us with the Phoenician understanding of their own origins, their cosmology, their early history, and their cultural development. His accounts are not filtered through foreign perspectives or later political agendas, but represent the authentic voice of Phoenician civilization at its height. According to Sanchuniathon, the Phoenicians trace their ultimate origins to the primordial forces of creation itself. His cosmogony begins with a description of the original state of the universe. All things consist of a dark mist, of an ethereal nature, the breath of dark mist and of a turbid chaos, black as Erebus. This description immediately establishes the African character of Phoenician cosmology, with its emphasis on primordial darkness and the creative power of blackness. This cosmological framework is fundamentally African in character. Throughout African religious and philosophical traditions, darkness and blackness are associated with the creative principle, the source of all life and wisdom. The Phoenician cosmogony, as preserved by Sanchuniathon, reflects this same understanding, presenting blackness not as the absence of light, but as the primordial creative force from which all existence emerges. Sanchuniathon describes how from this primordial darkness came the first divine beings, including Mort, the god of death and fertility, and the Zopharshaman, the overseers of the heavens. These divine beings were described as having fashioned in the forms of eggs and shining forth as the sun, moon, stars, and planetary spheres. This egg symbolism is found throughout African cosmological traditions and represents the potential for life and creation contained within apparent emptiness. One of the most significant figures in Sanchuniathon's account is Tautus, whom he identifies as the inventor of writing and the founder of Phoenician civilization. According to Sanchuniathon, Tautus was, first of all under the sun, to discover the use of letters and the writing of records. This attribution of the invention of writing to Tautus is crucial for understanding both Phoenician self-perception and their connection to African intellectual traditions. Tautus is explicitly identified by Sanchuniathon with the Egyptian god Thoth, Tahuti, the divine scribe and keeper of wisdom. In Egyptian tradition, Thoth was the inventor of writing, mathematics, and all the sciences. He was typically depicted as an ibis-headed god or as a baboon, and was considered the heart and tongue of Ra, the sun god. The identification of Tautus with Thoth establishes a direct connection between Phoenician and Egyptian intellectual traditions. The significance of this connection cannot be overstated. By identifying their culture hero Tautus with the Egyptian Thoth, the Phoenicians were explicitly acknowledging their debt to Egyptian civilization and their place within the broader African intellectual tradition. This was not a case of borrowing or influence, but of direct cultural continuity. The Phoenicians understood themselves to be inheritors and continuators of the Egyptian tradition of learning and wisdom. Sanchuniathon describes Tautus as bearing a tablet, pen, and palm branch, the phoenix tree. This description connects Tautus not only to Thoth, but to the broader African tradition of written wisdom. The tablet and pen are obvious symbols of literacy and learning, while the palm branch connects to the tree of life symbolism found throughout African religious traditions. According to Sanchuniathon's account, the establishment of Phoenician civilization was directly supervised by Tautus and the divine beings known as the Zopha-Shamin. These divine overseers eventually slipped into the dimension of our planet and interbred with the daughters of Earth. Their first landing place was Baalbek in Lebanon, where they constructed the massive stone platform that still exists today. Sanchuniathon describes how these divine beings devised Baetulia, contriving stones that moved as though having life, to build a grand trilithon platform. They used the art of magic words, mantras, to lift and move large stone blocks and open huge stone doors. This account of advanced construction techniques using sound and vibration has parallels in African traditions throughout the continent, where similar accounts of ancient construction methods are preserved. Under the supervision of Tautus, the progeny of these divine beings established Byblos, the first great Phoenician city. From Byblos, they spread throughout the Levant and into Egypt, establishing the network of cities and trade routes that would characterize Phoenician civilization. Sanchuniathon's account presents this expansion not as conquest, but as the natural spread of a superior civilization, bringing the gifts of writing, technology, and organized society to the peoples of the Mediterranean. The choice of Byblos as the first city is significant. Byblos was not only one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world, but it was also the center of the papyrus trade that connected Egypt to the rest of the Mediterranean world. The name Byblos itself is related to the Greek word for papyrus, Byblos, and ultimately gives us our word Bible, originally meaning the books. This connection to writing and learning reflects the central role that Phoenician civilization played in the transmission of African intellectual traditions throughout the ancient world. Perhaps the most significant of Sanchuniathon's works, from our perspective, is his treatise on the Phoenician alphabet, which is specifically mentioned by Eusebius. This work, unfortunately lost except for brief references, apparently provided a detailed account of how the Phoenicians developed their alphabetic writing system and how it related to the earlier Egyptian hieroglyphic tradition. The existence of this treatise demonstrates that the Phoenicians themselves understood the development of their alphabet to be a crucial part of their cultural identity and historical mission. They were not merely traders who happened to use writing for commercial purposes, but a people who saw themselves as the inheritors and transmitters of the sacred tradition of literacy that had originated in Egypt. The Phoenician alphabet, which forms the foundation of all modern alphabetic writing systems, represents one of the most important intellectual achievements in human history. By developing a simplified system of writing that could be learned and used by ordinary people rather than just a specialized priestly class, the Phoenicians democratized literacy and made possible the spread of learning throughout the ancient world. Sanchuniathon's account of this development, as preserved in fragments, emphasizes the divine inspiration behind the creation of the alphabet. According to his account, Tautus received the knowledge of alphabetic writing directly from the divine realm and was instructed to share it with humanity as a gift from the gods. This understanding of writing as a divine gift reflects the African tradition of viewing literacy and learning as sacred activities that connect human beings to the divine realm. Sanchuniathon's cosmological accounts provide crucial insight into how the Phoenicians understood their place in the universe and their relationship to other peoples. His description of the creation of the world, the emergence of the gods, and the development of human civilization consistently emphasizes themes that are central to African cosmological traditions. The emphasis on primordial darkness and water, the role of divine serpents and dragons, the importance of fertility and regeneration, and the cyclical nature of time all reflect cosmological concepts that are found throughout African religious traditions. These are not universal human themes, as some scholars have suggested, but specific cultural patterns that connect Phoenician thought to the broader African intellectual tradition. Sanchuniathon's account of the overseers of the heavens, Zophashamin, who came to Earth and established civilization, has parallels in African traditions throughout the continent. From the Dogon accounts of the Nomo to the Ethiopian traditions of the Kebra Nagast, African cultures preserve memories of divine beings who brought civilization and learning to humanity. Sanchuniathon's account places Phoenician civilization within this same tradition of divine instruction and cultural transmission. The invention of the alphabet represents one of the most transformative achievements in human history, fundamentally altering the trajectory of civilization by making literacy accessible to ordinary people rather than restricting it to a specialized priestly class. This revolutionary development, which forms the foundation of all modern writing systems, was the creation of the Phoenicians. Specifically, according to their own traditions, the divine figure Tautus, whom they identified with the Egyptian god Thoth. The significance of this achievement cannot be overstated. Before the Phoenician alphabet, writing systems were complex and cumbersome, requiring years of specialized training to master. The Egyptian hieroglyphic system, while sophisticated and beautiful, involved hundreds of different symbols and required extensive memorization. The Mesopotamian cuneiform system was similarly complex, limiting literacy to a small, educated elite. The Phoenician innovation was to create a system of writing that used a small number of symbols, originally 22 letters, to represent the basic sounds of human speech. This alphabetic principle, the idea that written symbols should represent sounds rather than words or concepts, was revolutionary in its simplicity and power. It meant that anyone who could speak could potentially learn to read and write, democratizing access to knowledge and information. According to Sanchuniathon's historical accounts, the invention of writing was not a human achievement, but a divine gift transmitted through Tautus. In his cosmogony, Sanchuniathon describes how Tautus was first of all under the sun, to discover the use of letters and the writing of records. This discovery was not presented as a gradual human development, but as a sudden divine revelation that transformed human civilization. Sanchuniathon's account emphasizes that Tautus received this knowledge directly from the divine realm. The god was described as the Logos of the Egyptian Tehuti, connecting the Phoenician tradition directly to the Egyptian god of wisdom and writing. This identification is crucial because it establishes the Phoenician alphabet not as an independent invention, but as a development within the broader African tradition of sacred writing that had its origins in Egypt. The description of Tautus as bearing a tablet, pen, and palm branch, the phoenix tree, provides rich symbolic imagery that connects the invention of writing to African religious and cultural traditions. The tablet and pen are obvious symbols of literacy and learning, while the palm branch connects to the tree of life symbolism, found throughout African spiritual traditions. The specific mention of the phoenix tree is particularly significant, as it connects the Phoenician tradition to the Egyptian Bennu bird, the original phoenix, which was associated with renewal, resurrection, and the cyclical nature of time. The connection between Phoenician and Egyptian writing systems is not merely symbolic, but demonstrably historical. Comparative analysis of the Phoenician alphabet and Egyptian hieroglyphic writing reveals clear developmental relationships between many of the letter forms. The Phoenician aleph derives from the Egyptian hieroglyph for ox head, the beth from the Egyptian house symbol, the gimel from the Egyptian throw stick, and so on. This is not a case of borrowing or adaptation, but of direct cultural transmission. The Phoenicians, as descendants of the same African population that had created Egyptian civilization, inherited the Egyptian tradition of writing and developed it in new directions to meet their own cultural and practical needs. The alphabetic principle that they developed represented not a rejection of Egyptian writing, but its logical evolution and simplification. The Egyptian influence on Phoenician writing extends beyond individual letter forms to the fundamental principles of the writing system. The Egyptian practice of writing consonants without vowels, the right-to-left direction of early Phoenician writing, and the use of writing for both sacred and secular purposes all reflect the continuation of Egyptian scribal traditions within Phoenician culture. In Phoenician culture, writing was not merely a practical tool, but a sacred activity that connected human beings to the divine realm. This understanding reflects the broader African tradition of viewing literacy and learning as spiritual practices that required proper preparation and respect. Phoenician scribes were not simply clerks or record keepers, but priests and scholars who served as guardians of sacred knowledge. The Phoenician temples contained extensive libraries and scriptoriums, where sacred texts were copied and preserved. These institutions served not only the Phoenician homeland, but the entire network of Phoenician colonies throughout the Mediterranean. The standardization of the Phoenician alphabet across this vast geographic area demonstrates the central role that writing played in maintaining Phoenician cultural identity and unity. The Phoenicians' role as merchants throughout the Mediterranean made them the primary agents for the transmission of alphabetic writing to other cultures. The Greek alphabet, which forms the foundation of all European writing systems, was directly derived from the Phoenician alphabet, with the Greeks themselves acknowledging this debt by calling their letters Phoenician letters, Phoenikeia grammata. The transmission of the alphabet was not simply a matter of teaching letter forms, but of transmitting an entire intellectual tradition. Along with the alphabet came Phoenician concepts of education, literature, record-keeping, and the relationship between written and spoken language. The Greeks, Romans, and other peoples who adopted the Phoenician alphabet also absorbed many of the cultural assumptions and practices that surrounded its use. The alphabet, which made possible the preservation and transmission of knowledge on an unprecedented scale, was created by African people and transmitted to the rest of the world through African cultural networks. The great literary traditions of Greece and Rome, which European civilization has long celebrated as its foundational achievements, were made possible by an African invention. The influence of the Phoenician alphabet extends far beyond the ancient world. Every alphabetic writing system in use today, Latin, Greek, Cyrillic, Arabic, Hebrew, and many others, can trace its ancestry back to the Phoenician alphabet. The figure of Tautus, as preserved in Sanchuniathon's accounts, represents more than just the inventor of the alphabet. He embodies the African intellectual tradition that values wisdom, learning, and the preservation of knowledge for future generations. His identification with the Egyptian Thoth connects him to the broader African tradition of divine wisdom and sacred learning that extends from ancient Egypt to the present day. Tautus serves as a reminder that the development of human civilization has always depended on the contributions of African thinkers, innovators, and culture bearers. His gift of alphabetic writing to humanity represents the generous spirit of African civilization, which has consistently shared its achievements with the rest of the world rather than hoarding them for exclusive use.